What we're looking at here is an M270 multiple launch rocket system opening fire on Russian targets in Ukraine. Rocket artillery like the M270 and its little brother HIMARS are perhaps the most effective weapons the West has given to Kiev to date. They have blown up tons of precious Russian ammunition, brought down bridges and railway lines, and helped level the battlefield between Ukraine and its much larger opponent. But what makes them so good? We're going to examine this tape, explain the tactics, get up close with the M270 on a NATO training base in Finland, and speak to the commander of an MLRS battery to find out. This is the M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS for short. It's a type of artillery, but rather than firing shells like a howitzer, it shoots rockets. It can carry up to 12 of them, which are stored in 2 pods with 6 rockets in each pod. These pods are loaded by hand, then winched into place on top of the vehicle using built-in cranes. They're stored up here, inside a launcher loader module, or LLM for short. This can rotate left and right and tilt up and down to point the rockets at their target. The LLM is mounted on the back of a vehicle called a carrier, which is armored to protect it against light weapons like machine guns and grenades. It weighs about 25 tons and has tracks which, unlike tires, cannot puncture and are less likely to get stuck in mud, meaning it can cross rough terrain. The tracks do make it kind of slow though, and it has a top speed of just 40 miles an hour. Inside are 3 crew: the driver, the gunner, and the commander. Without leaving the cab, these 3 can get the M270 into position, lock on to a target, and unload all 12 missiles in just 60 seconds. Once the missiles have been fired, they'll drive away to an ammo storage point where 2 more loaded missile pods will be waiting for them. They'll winch those into place, then drive on to a hiding location where the M270 can be concealed until it's time for its next mission. The M270 also has a little brother, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, which works basically the same way, except it's half the size. It only has 1 pod on top, holding 6 rockets instead of 12, and has wheels instead of tracks. This makes it lighter, faster, and quicker to fire and reload. If we go back to the tape, we can see the M270 in action. Here's the driver, and here's his commander and gunner. You can see the rocket pods are already loaded on top of their vehicle. This one is full of rockets, and this one here is empty. On the bottom of the rocket tubes, they've written messages for the Russians. This one says for Dnipro, a Ukrainian city that has been the target of Russian attacks. After receiving orders, they drive the vehicle into position. Then they use the onboard computer to lock onto their target. You can see the launch module on the back is now elevated to point at the target. Once they're locked on, it's rockets away. The M270 can be loaded with various types of rocket, but the ones donated to Ukraine mostly fire the Guided Multiple Launch Rocket System, or GMLRS for short. Each rocket is 13 foot long, 227 millimeters wide, weighs up to 660 pounds, and has a range of more than 45 miles. That is much further than standard artillery, which can only range around 18 miles. GMLRS rockets have 4 main sections. At the back is the tail, with the engine and fins that help stabilize the rocket in the air. In front of that is the fuel tank, which powers the rocket, and in front of that is the payload. Ukraine has been given 2 variants. One which includes a single explosive charge weighing around 200 pounds, and a second that has a smaller explosive charge but is packed with thousands of metal ball bearings. Near the top of the missile is the guidance system, which includes these little fins, or canards, that help steer the rocket in the air. And at the tip is the fuse, which is responsible for detonating it. If the missile is loaded with a single large explosive, the fuse will detonate on contact, making it effective against well-protected, high-value targets like command posts or ammo dumps. If it is loaded with ball bearings, the fuse will trigger just above the target, throwing them out across a wide area, which is useful for taking out troops and lightly armored vehicles. Here, I've got some additional footage which shows what I'm talking about. This shows several precise GMLRS rockets hitting the headquarters of Russian Special Forces located in the Kherson region. You can see one rocket landing just here, and another a few moments later here. They kick up a lot of rubble and debris, which means a large and powerful explosion, but only in one spot, and only as the missile hits. That means they're armed with the 200-pound single explosive charge set to detonate on contact. Whereas this tape shows a GMLRS rocket filled with ball bearings hitting a Russian Pion artillery gun. You can clearly see the rocket explodes in the air, a fraction of a second before it would have struck its target. That throws the ball bearings out in a very distinctive circle pattern, which you can see on the ground here. This causes far less damage than the impact warhead. You can actually see the Pion gun is still intact even after a direct hit, although it is on fire. But it spreads that damage over a far wider area, ensuring any nearby ammo, supply vehicles or troops are also destroyed. But the M270 has one more trick up its sleeve. Instead of being armed with GMLRS rockets, it can be loaded with the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS for short. These are the same length as the GMLRS, 13 feet, so they can fit in the same launcher, but are much wider and heavier. Because of this, only 2 of them can fit on top of the M270, one in each pod, or a single one on HIMARS. Each missile measures 610 millimeters across, triple the size of the GMLRS, and weighs up to 3,700 pounds, or 1.6 tons. Like the GMLRS, it has 4 sections. At the rear is the control section, with the rocket motor and fins used for stability and steering. In front of that is the fuel tank, and then the warhead. Again, there are 2 variants. One containing 300 bomblets, small explosive charges designed to blanket a wide area, or a single high explosive charge weighing 500 pounds. At the tip is the guidance system, which works off GPS, and the fuse, which can be programmed to detonate above a target or on impact. Because the ATACMS is so much larger than the GMLRS, it has room for a lot more fuel and therefore has a much longer range, up to 186 miles. For that reason, it's mostly used by Ukraine to carry out strikes deep behind the Russian front line. Early last year, ATACMS were used to strike sensitive military bases in Crimea and, more recently, inside Russia itself. Taken together, these features make the M270 and HIMARS extremely effective weapons, and especially against Russia. But why? It's because the Russian army relies very heavily on its own artillery to advance on the battlefield. Since at least the Second World War, Russia's tactics have been to flatten enemy defenses from long range with lots of big guns, then send in troops to take over the rubble. In fairness to Putin and his generals, they did try to break their reliance on this tactic in 2022. Their initial invasion plan for Ukraine called for a Western-style advance, using skilled soldiers and a complementary mix of weapons to achieve a rapid victory. But that went very wrong very quickly. After retreating from Kiev and much of the north of Ukraine in spring 2022, Russia refocused on the Donbass and went back to its age-old artillery barrage tactics. In the spring and early summer of 2022, Ukraine lost a lot of troops and territory in the Donbass because they simply couldn't match the Russians for firepower. At one point, Putin's men were thought to be firing 10 shells for every 1 Ukrainian. The artillery barrage tactic may lack sophistication, but it is very effective. There seemed to be little the Ukrainians could do to stop this onslaught, and Putin promised the Russian people that soon the whole of the Donbass would be under their control. It was MLRS that helped level the playing field. Artillery barrages require lots of readily available ammunition, meaning huge stockpiles of the stuff have to be stored close to the front lines. These Russian ammo dumps were outside the range of conventional Ukrainian artillery, but well within range of M270 and HIMARS. When America donated these weapons to Ukraine in June 2022, the ammo dumps were their first target. In just 4 weeks, Ukraine said it hit no fewer than 50 of them, blowing up tons of ammunition in the process. They then turned the rockets on bridges and railways, making the task of getting what ammunition remained to the front line more difficult. Because MLRS are capable of firing their rockets, moving and reloading so quickly, a tactic known as shoot and scoot, they proved impossible for Russia to destroy. In fact, it would be 2 whole years before Russia scored a confirmed kill on either the M270 or HIMARS. And the rockets they fire, which travel up to 3 times the speed of sound, proved equally impossible for the Russians to shoot down. So the Russians had no choice but to move their ammunition away from the front line to get it out of range. Less ammunition, stored further away, and harder to transport meant no more blanket barrages from the Russian guns. And no more blanket barrages meant Russian troops found it much harder to advance. It took the Russians just a few weeks to capture the two cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk using their barrage tactics. But after the arrival of M270 and HIMARS, it took them a full 11 months to capture the nearby city of Bakhmut, and they lost an astonishing number of men in the effort. The Wagner Group alone, which was spearheading the effort to take the city, is thought to have suffered at least 20,000 casualties. In fact, HIMARS and M270 actually allows Ukraine to recapture a huge swathe of territory in Kharkiv as the Battle of Bakhmut was taking place. In a little over a month, Ukraine recaptured 5,000 square miles of territory, including 500 towns and villages, taking minimal casualties in return. This offensive rattled Putin so badly that he was forced to call up Russia's military reserves, press ganging 300,000 men into the army to stabilize the front line. M270 and HIMARS were absolutely key to this assault, blowing up Russian command posts and ammo dumps before the troops started advancing. One HIMARS strike on Izium even managed to kill the commander of all Russian artillery units in the area, ensuring the Russians couldn't effectively fire back. Using just a handful of M270 and HIMARS, Ukraine was able to silence entire Russian artillery batteries and grind their army to a halt. To this day, the Russian military has not come close to taking the whole of the Donbass, while at the same time, these weapons contributed to the most successful counterattack that Ukraine has ever mounted. Russia is still fighting to retake all of the territory it lost during that offensive, and that's why MLRS are arguably the most effective weapons the West has donated to Ukraine so far. Next, we went to a NATO live-fire drill in Finland, just days after President Biden gave Ukraine permission to fire MLS rockets into Russia to see how the M270 works. This is the M270 MLRS. We believe this system, or a system very like it, has probably been used by Ukraine to strike at targets within Russia. This is a tube rocket artillery system. You can see it has two pods with 6 rockets in each up here. They can be used to fire a salvo of missiles at enemies deep in the rear of the battlefield, interdicting logistics, taking out command posts, and eliminating other high-value targets. This system can also be configured to fire 2 ATACMS rockets, the very weapons that we believe Ukraine has used to strike inside Russia itself. And we're here in Rovaniemi, Finland, to analyze how it works. Here's what the M270 looks like up close. At the front, you can see the armored cab with 3 windows, one for the driver, one for the commander, and one for the gunner. Here's the driver in position. You can see how thick the door is with armored plating. And you can also see locking levers here and a rubber seal around the door here. This is to keep the cab hermetically sealed, so the crew are safe, even if biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons have contaminated the air. Down here are the tracks, which help the M270 traverse the rough, snowy terrain with ease. Here you can see the LLM in the elevated position just after firing. There's scorch marks around the ends of the launch tubes where the heat and force from the rockets has removed the paint. And here you can see the inside of the rocket tubes. These grooves are called rifling. They spin the rocket as it's launched to stabilize it in the air and give it extra range. And this little bit of metal down here is responsible for igniting the rocket when the commander hits the fire button. Here's how the M270 gets into position. Because this is a training exercise, the commander is poking his head out of the cabin for a better view, but in combat, he'd be inside. You can see the tracks traversing easily over the snow. Each of the tracks can be operated independently, so the system can make very tight turns. Here's how the LLM elevates, turns, and tips up and down to lock onto targets. If we take a look at this footage, we can also see how the M270 reloads. You can see the cranes clipping onto the rocket pods and the pods being winched into place. This video shows how maintenance is carried out on the engine. You can see the whole cab tips forward to allow mechanics to access the components.